Hello, and welcome to the South Coast Artists Index, where artists, performers, and writers, as well as curators, directors, and supporters, anyone with ties to the creative community, drops by to introduce themselves to you. We'll talk about their beginnings, their vision, their passion, and so much more. The South Coast Artist Index podcast is brought to you in part by Heavenly Spirits, who invites you to celebrate the art of life and creative communities everywhere. Learn more at heavenlyspirits.com.
Hi, it's Ron Fortier again with another episode of the In Focus podcast. And today, our guest is all the way from the West Coast, from Seattle. And I will let our guest introduce themselves and spell their name, and we'll take it from there.
Yeah, my name is William Perry. Last name is Perry. I grew up in Dartmouth, Massachusetts. My father was a lawyer there. He was a selectman in Dartmouth for a long time, Leonard Perry, and my brother still runs his law office in New Bedford. But I did another track. I originally, though, was into photography big time, and I'm a photographer now. I'm semi-retired, but spend a lot of time doing photography. And I got into it when I was in high school, at Dartmouth High School, and a teacher there called Brad Pierce, who just passed away, was really helpful to me because he had a dark room down there and he taught me a lot about photography and stuff. Always emphasized medium format cameras because he said the 35 millimeter is too small. So, and then after that, I went to Ohio University, and Ohio U at that time, and I think still does, is one of the best photography schools in the country, that and the Rochester Institute. In fact, the guy I mentioned, Bob Sunasak, he went to Ohio U too. But after a quarter, and this is kind of, I realized I'm not an artist. I can't draw to save myself. And they put me in an art class and forget it. So I continued photography, but then I just decided to go into history, and I ended up becoming a lawyer. I think if it was later on a photography major you could do from the journalism school, and if I'd done that, maybe I would have stuck with it. But the other thing that it gave me when I was at Ohio University, I got a 10-week trip to China. I got a full scholarship my senior year at Ohio U. My father gave me the money and said, go to Europe. So I went there for 10 weeks and became fascinated with international. And then after that, I was a Peace Corps volunteer for 2 years out in the Marshall Islands. The interesting thing was that I brought my camera and filmed there, and I took a lot of slides. And all of a sudden, very recently, I was on an atoll called the Namu Atoll, and I actually contacted those people and started uploading slides that I scanned in. And they're going crazy because it's their grandfather, their mother, their brother. And some of the pictures of the people I took have died. And so all these people are interested in what I'm putting up. So it gets very interesting.
Yeah, it does. It's a recording of history.
It is. You realize you're beginning to realize how much impact photography has because it's the recording of industry, of history. And but after that, I went out and was at the University of Hawaii for a while, spent time in Japan studying Japan, and then went to Columbia Law School, became a lawyer. And but then to further my international, I spent a year in Japan, and then worked at the International Trade Commission and the Commerce Department in Washington, D.C., doing bread and butter trade cases. Then went out on my own. And then after in Washington, I met a woman who was originally from Beijing, but she wanted to go back to the Northwest, but she lives in Vancouver. And therefore, I ended up in Seattle, which has surprised me. I'm really in Bellevue, Washington, which is right outside of Seattle. And it's a beautiful place here. We've got, flowers all around us and stuff, and snow-covered mountains in the distance.
Yeah.
And so that's the good part about it. And of course, the problem is it rains in the winter. Oh, God, it rains all the time. But other than that, and then what happened in photography is interesting. Is the whole thing changed when I was growing up. When I was in high school, my father actually built me a dark room. It was all dark room, and you could never do color. Forget color. And then everything went digital. And this also opened up the whole market. It used to be a lot of older guys who were doing film who would do what is called stock photography. And but I started really getting into digital, and digital changes everything. It changed the whole medium, the whole format, and it opened up an enormous market for photographers that wanted to get in, but it required a lot of time, because now where you take your film and you send it out for processing, and depended upon which side of the bed the processor got in, whether you get good results or not, now you have complete control of the process, from taking the photograph through processing in your computer through publication. And that's kind of what makes me a little different. My son told me this almost 10 years ago, and he was working at a TV station. Now he's a lawyer, DC, but he was working at a TV station. He said, "Dad, why don't you get into stock?" And I said, "What do you mean by that?" And he says, "Well, every weekend we spend all our time going through stock photography sites for the TVs." And I said, "Really? That's interesting." So I started doing that. Now I'm on, 10 different sites: Shutterstock, Getty, all these other places. Do I make a lot of money? No. I wish I did. And that's why I was interested in that storefront that you brought up. Mm-hmm. But on the other hand, sometimes recently I sold a one photograph. I got 1,000, so the site must have sold it for around 3,000. So, but that's highly unusual. Put it that way.
Now your focus, no pun intended, is I've seen some of your work, and Arctic and islands, kind of a wide range, isn't it?
Oh,
from
yeah.
tropical to yeah.
Well, see, what I decided to do something, which is the guys who really make it in stock, who make six figures, most of them are developers, and they are I'm not so developer. I'm sorry, designers. They're into the design market. They understand that market. And so there's people like Lisa Gagné and Sean Locke. They're big guys. They make 100, 200,000. Well, what they're into is lifestyle. And so they're doing it for advertising. So they'll have models and sets and stuff like that. So if you see a picture of somebody on a phone and they're talking about phoning into an office, or you get us at this phone number, it's probably a photograph from Sean Locke or Lisa Gagné or some people like that. Some people are really into lifestyle. I'm not into that. And the other thing, I made a decision. I was just going to shoot what I like, and if they accepted it, they accepted it, and if they sold it, they sold it. And I was much more into the travel side. So because I became an international trade lawyer after this, and I fly all over the world, and or have been. So that's why you'll see a lot of my stuff in China, because I was in China, and I spent 2 years opening an office in Beijing there for a while. And that's frankly just as I was getting into stock. And then recently, my wife is Chinese, and both of us love to travel. So I'll give a shout out. If you're interested in travel, look at Gate One Travel, some of the best deals in the world. $1,200 round trip to Europe, including a 10-week tour, including airfare. And it was just unbelievable. And so if you're into travel at all, look at them. And so we've been traveling all over the world now, and so we unfortunately, because of this pandemic, we had to cancel a trip to Thailand, and then we were on another almost 3-week tour to Europe, and then we had to cancel. And so we've got something set up for next spring in 2021. But right now, just the virus has killed everything. I mean, the tourism industry, the travel industry is really crippled. But anyway, so what I do is, but the last trip I made, for instance, was interesting. I went with my son, and we did Chile and Antarctica. And we did Santiago, then was down in the Patagonia, and then spent time in Antarctica. And the photographs I got out of there were just stunning. And so I'm putting those up now. But I've got now probably over 100,000 photos online. And basically, and again, not making much money, but having a lot of fun doing it, covering my equipment costs and some of the travel expenses. So it's been a lot of fun.
I was this. If you go back to Mr. Pierce, and one of the things I remember about him, he was a nice man. I didn't have him for math because, embarrassingly, I was in Armand Vieira's dummy math class for 4 years. There was nothing.
Me too. Not the same one. I was the dummy math class too. I never made Mr. Pierce.
Oh yeah, it was awful. And I just I didn't know how I learned, and they obviously, Armin Vieira, never learned how I learned either. But I do remember his the calculator he bought for the math department, which was the size of a VCR machine, and I think it only had three functions. If for some reason it couldn't divide or whatever. But moving on from there, now we had discussed offline that your dad and you are familiar with my cousin. He's my cousin 9 times removed. We come from the same progenitor, just different children, different sons.
Mm-hmm.
And he and I had planned on going over the genealogy. He was a wonderful man. When I lived on Prospect Street, I got all of his bills, which is kind of bizarre. And we're talking about Norman Fortier.
Right.
Did he influence you at all growing
up? A little
up?
bit. He was very interesting because he was very much into yacht photography, and he had his own boat that he would take out. He'd cover all the races, and he had a beautiful, must have been a large format camera, and he was taking just really beautiful pictures. And a lot of them were black and white, as I remember.
Mm-hmm.
But really stunning photography that my father had some of the point. But by the time I was in high school, I visited him several times over there, and he was down in Paderno. But he was moving more and more into the watercolor age, and he became really well known for his watercolors. And I don't know if it was him. In fact, my father has, when he died, he has an award through the New Bedford Yacht Club. Really, it's Paderno Yacht Club down there. Mm-hmm. And it's a watercolor of the harbor and some beetle cats floating around. I don't know if Norman did it, because he may have been dead by that time. But Norman, I've got a lot of his watercolors on the wall now around here. So
he used to send. Was it a New Year's card? It was a hand. It was a watercolor greeting card, basically. Each one of them individual. Yeah.
Frame some of them.
I think also too he may be the guy who photographed most of the Herreshoff collection, which obviously the Herreshoffs were one of the finest boat builders in the Northeast. Pleasure craft, sailing craft, or rag boats is the stink boaters, the motorized people like to call them. But going all the way back there, you couldn't have imagined the arc of your life, right?
No, never. I mean, how the hell did I end up here in Bellevue, Washington, married to a Chinese woman, and doing international trade law? I mean, nobody. My father was stunned because the chosen path was for me to follow who my brother's doing now and become a lawyer in New Bedford. And instead, I went to D.C. and became very much more involved in the international, which is what I really used my legal career to do international, which is what I loved. And that's, walking into a foreign country without any knowledge of the language or something and just trying to get around it. It's just fascinating. So I lived in Japan and I lived elsewhere, and it was just fascinating.
How is your life going to change as a lawyer? Let's just switch gears just a bit. As a lawyer, post-pandemic, because I'm sure there's going to be lawsuits flying all over the place.
Well, first, number one, I am really very close. I'm 70 years old, close to 71, almost fully retired now. And I've got a little bit of work I'm doing. People call me up all the time. See, my clients are mostly U.S. importers. So I'm very involved in this big U.S.-China fight. And so I did a conference call last week with a big group, strategy group, and about 100 companies online, all talking about China and what to do with the supply chains in China and stuff. And so I have a blog called USChinaTradeWar.com, but frankly, I haven't put up anything in a long time because I'm so pessimistic and so negative about what's going on right now. It's a very bad situation. And it's not just Trump; it's the pandemic that has changed everything.
Yeah,
and that's really made it there. So I'm becoming more and more moving from the legal side and more into my photography. I mean, the nice thing about being a lawyer is that you make pretty good money, and my wife is very good, and she's an accountant. She's very good at investing, So we've done well enough that I can continue doing this. I mean, I tell people who want to get into stock all the time, don't do this for your bread. Have another way to. I remember one guy, I was a young associate I was working with on a case. I took him to Shanghai with me, and he looked at me at one point and said, Bill, there are a lot of people who do who work on the side, like in law, to foster their art. So you're not the only one.
Well, I have a friend of mine. He was a year behind me at the University of Miami in the graduate program, and Steve was the Channel 5 art director back in the day. He decided to get out of the professional business and go into teaching, and like a lot of people found out, oh, you need a master's for that. So he went to the University of Miami, and in fact, his Channel 5 logo is still using it to this very day. And
Yeah.
Steve comes from an old Yankee family, the Fullers, and he loves a challenge. And somebody said to him that artists weren't smart enough to pass the LSATs.
The other thing was, I was going to mention one other thing, which is kind of another person who influenced me greatly is Paul Wong, who's my brother-in-law. And he owns the largest art galleries in both Seattle and Vancouver. It was the Bushy Art Gallery, and here it's Foster and White. And but Paul now ceramics. He was he did very well originally as a young man in art, and then told very famous artists. One was Jack Shadbot, which I didn't realize how famous he was. I'll tell you a story. But he told me that he said and he won a nationwide art gallery and show your work, and that's what he did. And I didn't realize how good. We have a print that my wife got, but she worked at his gallery originally, and a red bird. And I didn't realize much of it until I got a United, and I said, "Wow, this was a pretty big deal." So he's very famous.
That's another interesting thing. Here you have a brother in an art gallery, and you just so happen to be a photographer.
Yeah.
If you had any exhibits.
Well, he taught me a lot of things. And one of the things he taught me was, first, the importance of being unique, that really great artists are unique. They have a unique way of looking at things. And so stop copying. And that's the biggest problem in China right now. They're always copying. So that's the importance of being unique in art. And then the other thing he taught me was the way to look at things. Like an artist, because when you do your paintings, you have total control of everything within the four corners of that document. You can do anything you want. But Paul said with photography, you've got to realize, and what is be there, wherever there is.
Yeah.
But then you have to, when you see something and it doesn't look right, you have to move. And that's the difference too. You have to move and take a different picture. So for instance, every morning, usually I'm doing a 3.5 mile walk. We have to walk a lot, especially in Europe now. It's becoming, because of environmental concerns, et cetera, they're all walking areas. So we'll do 5-7 miles a day in Europe, easy.
Yeah.
And so that's one of the things I've learned. You got to keep your body, and so you can work or you can walk, and that's important. Pack all the way down to the boat to get on it. And but it was once you get on the boat, it's beautiful. But even then, you go out, in rubber boats and stuff. So it's active, and you got to be ready to do that. And that's
I only lived in Portugal.
Taught me a lot of things.
I lived in Portugal for a year, and I lost like 12-14 kilo in like 4 months. And I really didn't do anything except for that whole year. I had no car, and I based everything on a 20-minute walk.
Yeah.
And I think I visited last year. My mom's 93, and I went to go visit, and I looked at my phone, that health thing, the apps that they have on the iPhone, and I did like 10 miles, in one day. Most of my average was like 7 miles.
Yeah. You got to do it. I mean, I think that's one of the things it does is the thing about photography. I think it helps you health-wise, because you got to move.
Yeah.
Get out there.
Yeah.
And, even like nature photography, you got to move. So it's really what's going on.
I always ask photographers about that moment, being in the moment, because I think that's part of the. I mean, is there a little voice in your head that says squeeze the trigger, or take that shot? Because sometimes I'm walking and I see something, and I'm so mesmerized by it. I'm not a photographer, but I'm so mesmerized by it, and I realize, nobody's going to believe I saw this, so I won't even believe it. And by the time I get my phone out, it's gone.
Yeah.
But I have a friend who's a photographer, and he seems to be 3 seconds ahead in the time-space continuum. He can see something, and then he's got that 3 seconds to react.
Yeah, I think that first things first. Understand, because of the huge change in technology. And what I mean by that, when I was shooting film, you had 24 shots. You had to really be careful with every one you made, and you'd be very careful. You can basically run off as much as you want, and this lets you become much more experimental. You couldn't be experimental with film. Now you can be very experimental. And so that allows you to do things that you normally wouldn't do, and then try it, see if the shot works or not. But I think it's in high school, because I'm used to looking out of camera lenses all the time. I just know where things move. But I see photography as 3 aspects. And I think most photography is a third of the time. The other third of the time is processing. That's Lightroom Photoshop. And Lightroom Photoshop allow you to manipulate the image a little bit. I try not to put really noob skies in there or something like that because it becomes weird. But I do a lot of processing, especially I almost think of photography as you take a brass plate and then you scrub it to bring out the image in it. And sometimes that's really what you're doing. What it allows you to do now, processing, is to get a perfectly exposed image. For instance, if you take a picture of Mount Rainier, if you shoot for your exposures for the mountain, all the foliage is dark. But here is too light, you can't see it. They used to use filters for this. But now you can do what is called cross-processing using Photoshop and put the two images together, exposing perfectly for the mountain, perfectly for the vegetation up front. But it's work. And so there's a lot of work you can do now in Photoshop and Lightroom to get what I call the perfectly exposed picture. And you can also, now when you bring something up in Photoshop, you can use your lasso tool and everything to go into an area that's not too dark and make it a little lighter to bring out the details. Also, what I'm trying to do is what I call pop, which is to make that, I want people when they look at my photographs to go, wow, to let the image pop. But then after processing, the third thing is publication. And this is where everybody breaks down. And because people want to spend it because you don't make that much money on it. But publication is really important, I think, because it's how you make your photographs fly. And now I gave you a link, which is Bill Perry /Shutterstock. If you do that in Google, you'll find that through Shutterstock, my images are National Geographic, but you get published all over the place. And when I was in Dartmouth, while I was in high school, I was the photographer for the Dartmouth Chronicle many years ago. And my photographs would end up on the front page in the publication. It was neat watching your photographs show up in all these different publications online and everywhere else. So you never know. I mean, they're in books, they're in periodicals, they're everywhere. It was funny, one of the Bibles, a magazine called Outdoor Photographer, and $13 you can subscribe to it, a huge following and stuff. And I remember I never submitted into any contests, but then all of a sudden I open up Outdoor Photographer and there's an advertisement for a photography trip down to Arizona or Mexico to see Indians. And so they paid for it and boom, put it in as advertisement for the photography trip, which I just thought was a gas. You're always getting paid for something going on outdoor photography. But that's kind of the thing, is to get published about your stuff. It's really weird.
Yeah. I remember I spent 40 years, just round figures, plus or minus, in marketing and advertising. And I remember when digital started to creep its little head up, and a lot of my photographer friends, Richard Souza, who lives in Fairhaven, he was one of my go-to guys because he was multi-purpose. He could do product photography, which was very difficult. He knew jewelry, which is very difficult. He knew food, which is very difficult. And he was beside himself. He didn't know what's going to happen. He said, look, he says, I've got quite an investment in my cameras and my lenses. It's going to cost me $10,000 for one damn camera. What am I going to do?
Yeah, right.
And I guess, because I didn't follow up on this, but I guess the lenses stayed the same. The camera bodies, I guess somebody figured out, we could just sell the bodies and leave the lenses alone.
The thing on the bodies, the cameras, it's very interesting. And I think the biggest new development in cameras has been the movement of Sony. And I watched that kind of closely. And many years ago, I had Nikon, but I went to Canon and was very big into Canon for a while. But it was very heavy, and I had a whole Canon outfit, and et cetera. And then recently have moved to Sony, because Sony is really big on the mirrorless. And they're combining their video technology with their photography technology. So I think they're starting to lead the pack, and their electronic viewfinders and stuff. I paid $3,500 for it. Now, this is a year ago, but I had a lot of my old lenses. So it's not quite as bad as that, as $10,000. I mean, if you're going to go with some of these big lenses for birds and stuff, like 600 millimeter. But right now, for instance, when I travel, I have a kit, which is, I use a wide angle and a Tamron, which is about 28 to, I think it's 150, and then I have a 70 to 300 lens. But here's the change, which is fast full frame. In full frame cameras, those with the chip is the size of the 35 millimeter negative. But what happens is they also have ones called ASPC filter sensors, and they're 2/3 the size of the 35 millimeter negative. Because of that, so my 300 millimeter in my telephoto using ASPC becomes a 500 millimeter. And then I have a 400 Sony and a doubler, which would get it out to 800. But then through the crop factor, I can get it over to 1,000 millimeters. Now that's a big long lens, and I don't take it with me everywhere because it's heavy. But the point is, with that my photography, and I watch what I sell, what the stuff that I sell the most of still is the landmarks. And it's basically travel photography. I've done a lot in Mexico. I got the Colonial Cities tour in Mexico. And some of mine were the first stuff up on San Miguel de Allende and Guanajuato area, Mexico City. And all of a sudden, I was selling a lot from that area. And so, and the other thing I do is churches and religion, because now the thing is you can walk in to a church without a flash, shoot at 800 to 1,000 ISO and get a reasonably acceptable photograph that will be accepted by the sites. And so that's pretty big. And then, I've been to places like the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem and Rome. I mean, I got it was 2 or 3 years ago at Christmas, I got a contact from a monk down in Brazil, and it was a monastery. And the reason was I took pictures of, do you know what the Guadalupe is?
Guadalupe.
Do you know what the Guadalupe is?
The Lady Guadalupe? Yes.
Yeah. Yeah. And so this is the most sacred spot in the Americas. And the story is, obviously, this peasant, it's in the 1500s, Cortez comes into Mexico, and there's this Mexican peasant wandering around the fields. This woman in blue shows cheer. He goes down and talks to the bishop. Bishop says, I need a sign. He's wandering around 2 or 3 weeks later. The lady in blue shows up and says, where's my church? And he said, Bishop says, got to have a sign. He said, go up the hill. He opens up the cloak, and it's this weird painting, almost like the Shroud of Turin, of the Guadalupe. And it ended up with this huge place in the Americas. It's why Mexico is the second most Catholic country in all of the world, and right after Italy. And so I ran to the Guadalupe, and I took pictures of the actual Guadalupe and put them up on the online. And I contacted me, says, yours is the only photograph of the actual Guadalupe. We were trying to give it to the head of our monastery as a Christmas present. I said, sure. So that's what I did. And so it's this kind of wild stuff that I found. And it's really, really very, very interesting area.
Yeah. I mean, right now, people are much more visual than they've ever been. When I was still teaching, it was, I go back, the kids would read a chapter, and then it got down to, they'd read a couple of pages, then it got down to you're barely able to get them to read a single page, even on slides, a slide deck, the presentations, but visuals became more important than the text. And so you really had to scour to get these really good visuals to put into the PowerPoint presentations for them to pay attention, because, what is it? The picture's worth 1,000 words, right? The South American trip to Chile, I have a friend of mine who's from there, from Santiago. The colors of the Arctic, the Antarctic, are phenomenal. They're not like anything that most desolate place to be. What was your first trip there like?
Well, this was, I think you're right, it's the colors. And it's partly because you don't realize how many blues are down there, especially the blues and the pictures of the icebergs and the ice and the glacier. What is interesting is when the glaciers ice, they calve off and you become icebergs, but the oxygen is pressed out of the snow and it becomes blue. And you've got these unbelievable, almost iridescent blues down. The wildlife is unbelievable. So we were at one point in one of these harbors and surrounded by whales, humpback whales all around us. And they were feeding on the krill, which is the shrimp that's underneath you, all the shrimp, the krill. But the whales were all around us. I had whales going underneath our rubber boat. We're in a small rubber boat. We had 4 whales go right underneath. It was just unbelievable. The colors were something. And Patagonia gave you a taste of it, because they take you to a glacier there in Torres del Paine, and you see the blue of it. But I also I can see it when you go up to Alaska and in Artist Point or Mount Rainier here, you get to see a little bit of that blue from the glaciers. And that's really, it's phenomenal. So Antarctica is just really, really very interesting. And the wildlife there is fascinating. And so what you don't realize, for instance, you leave Venus, which is the southern tip of Chile, to go to Antarctica. We flew to Antarctica. But the problem with Punta Arenas, it's the same latitude as London. That's what everybody thinks the Antarctica is like the Arctic. No, Antarctica is so big, it is, and how much area, mass it covers. So you think about it, the tip of Chile is like you're being in London. That's how much difference it is. So this really surprised. And the tours down to Antarctica, you're really going to the Antarctic Peninsula. So it's not like you're in the center of the South Pole or anything. You're on one of the peninsula, which is out there, but it's still wild, to go down now. And the tourist period is from about November to about February, March. Remember, it's opposite because it's the southern hemisphere.
Right.
And one of the tour guides I was talking to would do the summer in Antarctica, the summer in the Arctic. So they would go back and forth like this.
Wow. The colors always struck me. The first time I'd ever seen it, believe it or not, was in the Kennebec River on the way up to Canada. Yeah. There's, I guess what they call fall spring or an ice out, late January, beginning of February. That's when they pull all the ice fishing houses off the river, and then you start to see these massive heaves, and the blue was startling. It was like sapphire.
Right.
I'm transitioning from my abstract work back to something that I had explored back when I was going for my MFA, the Arctic whaling expedition of 1862, I think it was. And, something just fascinated me about it. And I'm torn between doing the very foggy, gray kind of, stormy kind of imagery versus those knock your eyes out kind of colors. And so I'm sort of still processing that in my head. I guess the best thing to do is just to stop painting and see where it goes from there. The Seattle part, I was there back in '92. A couple of things that, the food, you just can't get away from the food. It's one of the biggest food towns I've ever been in. Yeah. Leaving SeaTac, Seattle-Tacoma Airport, and seeing was it Rainier, Olympia, and Mount St. Helens? Yeah. Yeah, that's startling. And I also was there for like 3 or 4 days, and it was like 82 degrees and sunny. And everybody kept telling me this doesn't happen. But I stayed at the Westin. Yeah, it was stayed at the Westin, and there's Trader Joe's downstairs, and it's a phenomenal community. Now you said your wife is from Vancouver. I remember we went to.
If you really want to know, she's from Beijing.
Beijing, yeah. Well, she was living at that time.
Beijing, right? and then she ended up in Vancouver, and then she wanted to go back to the Northwest, so that's how we ended here.
But, I mean, it's such a large population there.
Around. Yeah, well, it's all spread out. This is why, in a way, if you look at Washington State, it's Democrat. But the weird thing about it is that it's just Bellevue, et cetera. And that area is very, very Democrat. But the rest of the state, and we're talking a lot of it, is bright red Republican. And so it's this very interesting situation here. Mine used to say, he lives on Mercer Island. He's originally from the New Bedford, Dartmouth area. And he said he was a heart surgeon here. But he said, I get on the top of my house and I can see 4 national parks. And that's pretty amazing when you think about it. See Mount Baker, Mount Rainier, the Olympics, and the Cascades. And so you're surrounded by that. I come here after July 1st. And the reason is there are 2 places that artists should see. One is called Sunrise on Mount Rainier, but it only opens up after July 1st because they clear the snow out. And you can drive all the way up about over 6,000 feet and then walk up to the snow line. And it's stunning. Artist Point. And that's near Mount Baker. And you go up and to the Mount Baker Highway, you take a right, and there's a place called Pitcher Lake, which is a picture of Mount Shuksan and a reflection. It's in all the calendars. But then you go out to this little parking lot, and you end up walking out as Mount Shuksan. But about 4 years ago, they had to close it down because in July there was 50 feet of snow there. Wow. So when you go up there to Artist Point, you can there'll be snow usually up there, so you're walking up through it's stunning. It's just stunning up there, and that's why coming after July 1st is important.
Yeah, the senior day was phenomenal. I mean, I did a presentation at Magnolia Point, and I think is it Cook's Bay?
Yeah.
Because it was a place called La Cucina. It was al fresco dining, and they took the order and such. And while waiting, it was the amount of I've seen seaplanes, but on that particular day, I saw more seaplanes than I have my entire life, taking off and landing, going into Vancouver. Yeah. And I remember the signage being in 3 different languages. I think it was. There was. I don't know if it was Taiwanese or Chinese. I'm assuming there's a slight difference. I should know better because a lot of my students are Asian. There was a large population of Norwegians because you can always tell with the bumper stickers. I don't know if they still have them. Caution, Norwegian driver. Yeah. But how has this living out there and all of this affected your photography? I mean, you've been a photographer since the mid '60s, and that's a long way to go. How has living there affected you?
The big difference is the real difference for me in my life, because I was 20 years in Washington, D.C., and now 20 years in Washington State. Yeah. And I always begin, whenever I talk about trade law, I have to say Washington is not Washington. The beauty of Washington, D.C. it's like Paris. It's the closest city to Paris. It was a planned city. So the beauty of is the monuments, going around seeing all the different buildings. I mean, fascinating. The history and the man's architecture is just stunning right there. And so Washington, D.C. is fascinating in that sense, and it's very international, et cetera. Washington State, it's nature, baby. Let's get back to nature. And you're right close to all these different affects you is really nature all around you. And my house here doesn't have one of the views. We've looked at it, but I'm almost surrounded by green. And I get a few glimpses of snow-covered mountains in the distance. But it's a very different, it's much more and out in Bellevue here, it's more rural. So that's part of even with the shutdown, we go out and walk all the time. And you get beautiful views of the city and the mountains in the distance. So that's the difference here. It's really getting back to nature. I I think the difference is in Dartmouth, the nature was focused on the water. And it was, my father was focused on getting on the water, go out there and stuff like this. Here, it's colder here. But the other focus here is not just the water, it's the mountains, the snow-covered mountains that are around here. I mean, I can go skiing, even though I don't ski, by just going 60 minutes east of here to Snoqualmie Pass. And what I love to do is go over the place. And there's some hikes I do up there, et cetera. But it's a beautiful area.
Now, there's another Dartmouth High School graduate out there. She was a year behind me, so that was the class of 72. Bethany Stalins. It was Bethany Smith, who's living out there. There's an amazing amount of people from New Bedford. And I remember I had to go do a presentation because I launched a marine paint line for Cartol's Coating back in '92. And I said, how am I possibly going to make any connection between New Bedford and Seattle? And it hit me like a flash. Do you remember the television show Here Come the Brides?
Yeah, I remember that. Yeah.
The skies are always blue in Seattle. It was a kind of an interesting story. I never got a chance to get into it deep enough, but public Pike Place and which was Skid Row at one time, and that these loggers were desperate for water in Bedford, which I'd have to reinvestigate that someday.
I was going to tell you one other thing.
Yeah.
Now this explains. I'm also very much into red wine.
Okay.
The second best wine growing place in the country outside of California is Washington State. And what's fascinating about this is this explains the weather. It strays from Juan de Fuca there, and it's opposite Seattle. And it ends up being what's called a convergence zone. So all these clouds come in, and they're sucked in through the strait, hit Seattle. That's where you get a lot of rain. Then it goes to the Cascade Mountains, and it stops. There's a place called Woodinville, which is like 20 minutes away from here. And it's 150 to 200 wineries and tasting rooms. And where do these guys get their grapes? They all get their grapes in eastern Washington. In eastern Washington, it's a high desert, and it's dry, and that's very good for wine.
Right.
And so that's why you've got unred wine at all. I tell people, go to Costco, get Horseheaven Hills. It's called 3H. It's $9.89 a bottle. It's one of the best Cabernets you'll ever have.
So it's a Cabernet. I was assuming Pinot Noir, because if you're going down to Oregon, that's huge over there. And some of those red grapes are, especially the Pinot, are cooler weather kind of. But what a contrast in the state, huh? From one end to the other.
Right. Well, Pinots are also. It's interesting because we have much larger wineries up here. Pinots, the skins are thinner, so they have to do more hand picking. So a lot of the wineries in Oregon are smaller. Here in Washington, they're much bigger, and it's because machine picked. They can also be hand picked, but it's a much bigger operation here.
Is Columbia Crest?
Go to Eastern Washington. Columbia Crest and Chateau Ste. Michelle and Columbia Crest. In fact, these two are probably the largest wineries, but they're almost like, and I can't remember, it will come back to me, but it's Sterling Vineyards, which owns the vineyards in California. So it's a conglomerate, really.
Right.
And if you go to Chateau Ste. Michelle, it's really interesting at Woodinville. They've got their big thing there, and they've got a nice tour. But the better wine is the smaller wineries. And some of the small wineries are just phenomenal. Yeah,
there's like Selwyn and Williams was probably one of the more famous stores. I used to do a wine show it was public access, and we went to Channel 6 in Providence, and then we did a pilot. My neighbor and friend, former neighbor, current and still friend, Mike Daigle and I, we were known as the Wine Guys. Mm-hmm. And it was a pretty amazing journey. We were trying to de-snobify wine and make it wine for the everyday person. And it's a lot of things that we learned are just phenomenal. Anyway, we're wrapping this up, and when you're in semi-retirement, so what do you think is going to? My final question. So, what do you think is going to happen when you finally, absolutely, positively retire?
Well, I think that it's already happening in the sense I'm transitioning more and more to doing more and more photography. The big thing, my hope is that travel restrictions will open up, and so we can get out there again. And just more, and I just keep, you spend a lot of time doing a lot of photographs and putting up online and seeing what sticks. I almost think it's like what is the old line with spaghetti? You throw it up on the wall and see what sticks.
Right.
So I'm seeing the same kind of transition. I mean, that's the difference between an artist like you and a photographer like me. You make each piece, you put a lot of time into it. Whereas we're selling more and more, it's becoming a bulk market. I will put up runs of 80 to 90 photographs in a run. And so that gives you an idea. That's why, and I'll be on 10 different sites, so you can easily see how I can get a number of photos up there. And it's because everything's it's sales in bulk. That's the way it is right now.
Yeah.
That's the way it is with the digital market. I mean, it's tough because there's, I think somebody said at one point, there's 1 billion photos online now. So you really have to be able to stand out from the herd extent. It's coming up with a style that fits.
Yeah. My wife is a graphic designer, and so she spends a good amount of her time. They use 123RF. That's one of the sites that they use, and
I'm on that site.
I'll tell her to look for your tag. And she's been doing a series of recipes for a seafood company, And yeah, it's funny because there's a market that's sort of like self-cannibalizing. You're shooting and selling stock and taking the money out of your own hand or mouth, so to speak, on the other end, because the reason people are using stock is because they can't afford to hire you specifically. Yeah. So, we were looking at...
I think there's the other thing about digital that's really important, I think. If you think about it, when you're film, you had to put so much money into processing. Mm-hmm. Now, other than the camera and equipment and your computer, and you've got a Lightroom and Photoshop now you can get for $10 a month. And so basically it doesn't cost a lot of upfront costs. So I'm not printing a lot of ink and that sort of stuff and paper, matting and everything else like that. I'm just selling images. So in a way, it's a little bit easier because you don't have to put a lot of upfront costs into it. Yeah. And so, that's kind of the way to go. And that's one of the things. I mean, it's amount of stuff, but it's, I was trying to get my Paul into moving into more of the online stuff because I think that's, again, I mean, think about it. Because of all the stuff I've got online, over 1 million people have seen my photos. Mm-hmm. So that's kind of interesting.
Yeah, it is.
You get a much wider audience than you got there.
Yeah, and now the thing is to try to stand out, to jump out, to see a photograph and not know who you are personally, but especially I was an art director for a while, you start to see this style, this eye, and he's like, gee, I wonder if that's the same guy. And it's, it's this guy. I don't know how good the quality is going to come out. I don't know how much they can scrub this up. Zoom is way better than Skype, but sometimes there's just a connection issue. Yeah. But regardless, I'd like to do another one of these with you because I always tell everybody it's not a one and done. It's not your one-shot deal. And it's been fantastic. I mean, I've known you through Facebook, and now I got to hear and see you. And there's so much more to your story, and I'd like to delve into that.
Well, the other thing is I do have it's like a private group, so somebody contacted me through Facebook. But I have a little group I started of interested photographers who are also interested in stock, just to talk photography and stuff. And I try using, this is a point you made originally, the iPhone now has gotten so good. And if you want to do snapshots, I told my boss in my law firm, don't get a law firm, don't get a camera, just use your iPhone. Your iPhone has replaced all the small cameras that used to be there. I mean, if you try and just shoot snapshots and everything, the iPhone does it. And they've gotten it's so good in resolution. So I'm often doing flower shots I put up every day just to keep people interested.
All right, it's interesting. I'm gonna recommend a friend of mine who lives here in town. He has family out in Seattle. His mom is Norwegian. Yeah. His name is John Robson, and he's been out there quite a bit. I think he's been out to Point Barrow, Dutch Harbor. So you've probably crossed paths at some point in time. Right. And he's always looking for markets as well. Bill, thank you so much. This is Ron Fortier with another episode of the In Focus podcast, brought to you by the South Coast Insider. See you next time, and I hope you enjoyed this presentation. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
We'll see you next week for another episode of the South Coast Artist Index podcast. The South Coast Artist Index podcast is brought to you in part by Heavenly Spirits, who invites you to celebrate the art of life and creative communities everywhere. Learn more at heavenlyspirits.com. To learn more about the South Coast Artist Index, visit theartistindex.com. Find us on Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube. Be the artist you believe you are, and let's take care of each other out there.